The verdict. The room was built to make people feel small. The grand chamber of the Galactic Council sat at the center of Nexus Station, a massive structure floating in the cold dark between 3 star systems. Nobody owned that space. That was the point. Neutral ground. Sacred ground, some species called it. The chamber itself had walls that curved up like the inside of a shell, and the seats were arranged in wide rings, each one higher than the last, so that whoever stood in the center always had to look up at everyone watching them. On this particular evening, the center was empty. Nobody needed to stand there. The decision had already been made before the session even started. 47 species were represented in that room. Some of them had been part of the council for thousands of years. The Drath had helped write the original charter. The Mireth had negotiated 41 wars into peace treaties. The Pleiadians had given the council its legal framework, its courts, its system of rules. These were old civilizations, patient ones. They had seen young species come and go, some of them burning bright and fast, others collapsing under their own weight before they could ever reach the stars properly. Humanity was the current problem. Ambassador Velcara of the Drath Dominion stood at her elevated seat and did not raise her voice. She never needed to. Her voice was low and flat, and it carried the kind of weight that came from centuries of political power. She was tall, gray-skinned, with 4 narrow eyes that moved independently of each other. When she spoke, the translation systems hummed quietly in every delegate's earpiece. "The situation," she said, "is no longer a matter of patience." She pulled up the record. Everyone in the room had already read it. She went through it anyway, because she wanted it spoken aloud, wanted it on the formal record, wanted no one to be able to say later that they had not heard it clearly. Humanity. Interstellar travel achieved 173 years ago. First contact with Council species 89 years ago. In those 89 years, they had disrupted 4 major trade agreements, settled 3 systems that had been designated as protected zones under Council law, refused twice to appear before the Council's judicial board, and most recently sent a formal letter to the Council's executive chamber that was, to put it politely, not diplomatic. The letter had said, in plain language, that Earth did not recognize the Council's authority over human expansion, human trade, or human governance. It had been signed not by a single ambassador, but by the entire unified command, all 12 of them, which meant it was not a mistake or a rogue official, it was policy. Velcara let the silence sit after she finished reading. "They are not going to change," she said. "We have given them time. We have sent representatives. We have offered terms, 3 separate times, and each time they have refused. They are a young species and they are moving fast, and if we do not act now, they will be too large to act against at all." Councillor Orinthes of the Pleiadian Union raised his hand. He was older than most in the room, pale blue, with a rounded face and eyes that always looked slightly worried. He had been on the Council for 40 years, and he had opposed every act of collective force the Council had ever voted on. "What exactly are we proposing?" he asked, though he already suspected. Velcara looked at him without expression. "Removal of leadership. Precise. Clean. The 12 members of Earth's unified command. Without them, the human government loses its structure. The remaining political bodies will fracture. They will be manageable." Orinthes was quiet for a moment. "You are talking about assassination." "I am talking about strategic elimination of a destabilizing force," Velcara said. "The word you choose is your own concern." Several delegates shifted in their seats. A few looked at their screens. Nobody spoke. Velcara continued. "She had already arranged it," she explained. "Not contingent on the vote, she had merely made preliminary contact. The Shades. Everyone in the room knew the name. They were the oldest and most respected guild of their kind in the galaxy. Myrith by species, shadow stalkers by nature, capable of moving through shielded environments without triggering a single alarm. They had been used before, discreetly, by 3 different council members in the past century. They did not fail. That was not a boast. It was simply their record. 19 of them, Velcara said, would be sufficient for 12 targets. The vote was called, 44 in favor, 3 against. Orinthes sat back in his seat and stared at the ceiling of the chamber, and said nothing. Beside him, the two other dissenters, a Vihari delegate and an elderly Sonathi ambassador, looked equally still. They did not protest. The vote was legal. The motion had passed. The session was closed. Delegates began to file out, speaking quietly among themselves, some looking relieved, some looking like they had just signed something they could not unsigned. Velkara stood and gathered her materials with calm, practiced efficiency. She did not look pleased, exactly. She looked finished, like a person who had completed a task they had been meaning to complete for a long time. The Shademaster Zyvan received the contract 3 hours later. He was not on Nexus Station. He was already in transit, because Velkara had sent a preliminary signal 2 days before the vote, and Zyvan had learned long ago that preliminary signals from the Drath almost always became confirmed orders. He reviewed the contract from a small ship, moving quietly through a corridor of empty space. 12 targets, human, politicians and military commanders, all of them based either on Earth or on Luna Station. He read the files with mild interest. Humans were physically unimpressive, short-lived. They relied heavily on technology and seemed to compensate for their biological limitations with complicated systems and infrastructure. Their security was dense, but not sophisticated, at least not by the standards he was used to. He approved the contract. 19 Shades would deploy in 4 teams. They would be in position within a standard week. The operation would be complete within the month. Zyvan set the contract aside and looked out at the stars passing by. He had done harder things. Back in the Grand Chamber, Orinthes was one of the last to leave. He walked slowly, and when one of his staff members asked if everything was all right, he said yes, automatically. The way people say yes when the real answer is something they have not fully formed yet. He thought about the human letter. He had read it several times, not just the political content but the tone of it. There was something in the way it was written that he could not quite name. It was not angry. It was not afraid. It was almost calm, and underneath the calm was something that felt like a person who had thought about the situation from many different angles and already knew which ones to worry about. He did not know enough about humans to say if that meant anything. He told himself he was being too careful. 44 of his colleagues had looked at the same information and come to a comfortable conclusion. He was probably overthinking it. He walked back to his quarters and tried to sleep. He could not sleep. Outside, in the cold dark between the stars, 19 shadows began to move toward a small and unremarkable solar system at the edge of the mapped galaxy, where a young species lived on a blue-green world and had no idea, or so everyone assumed, that anything was coming. The first team of Shades arrived at the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday. They did not know it was a Tuesday. Human calendar systems were irrelevant to them. But somewhere on the blue planet below, people were going to work and making coffee and complaining about the beginning of the week, completely unaware that 4 of the galaxy's most dangerous beings had just slipped past the outer sensor net like water, through a crack in old stone. The Shades were good at this. They were, by most measures, the best in the galaxy at this specific kind of work. Their biology helped. Mirith could slow their own metabolic rate to near zero, which made thermal scanners useless. They could flatten the electromagnetic signature of their suits to a level that confused most detection arrays. They moved in short, precise bursts, pausing in the spaces between active sweeps, reading security patterns the way a reader reads a page quickly, and without having to go back. The first team's target was Admiral Suhan Park, the head of Earth's Combined Fleet Command. She worked from a building on the outskirts of Sol. The Shades had her daily schedule, the layout of the building, the rotation of her personal security detail, and a complete map of the ventilation system. They had done more with less. They moved through the outer districts of the city at night, using the service tunnels that ran under the old metro system. Their suits adapted to the local light conditions. They communicated in tight beam signals, no sound. They reached the building. Team leader Veth paused at the lower access point and scanned the interior. The scan came back clean. No anomalies. Veth signaled the team forward. They were never seen again. The second team had similar results, which is to say they had no results at all. Their target was Secretary Aldrin Cole, the civilian head of Earth's unified command, and the man whose signature appeared first on the letter that had offended the Council so deeply. He lived in a residential complex on Luna Station, an orbital habitat above the moon. The Shades arrived via a cargo relay, embedded inside a sealed container that had been pre-positioned on a passing freighter 3 weeks earlier. The planning had been meticulous. They entered the station through an unmanned maintenance corridor. They moved through 3 residential levels. A junior member of the team, a young Shade named Osik, on only his second contract, noted that the corridors felt strangely empty for a populated station. He flagged it to the team leader. The team leader told him it was nothing. Humans kept irregular schedules. Osik accepted this. He was new. He trusted his team leader. The team leader was wrong. They turned a corner and entered a long corridor with a sealed door at the far end. The seal code matched their intelligence. The door opened. They went through. The door closed behind them. Nothing came out. By the end of the first week, Zyvan had lost 11 Shades and received 0 reports. This was new. In 30 years of running contracts, Zyvan had never lost contact with a deployed operative without receiving at least a termination signal. The automatic burst transmission, a Shade suit sent if the operative was killed or captured. No termination signals, no distress calls, no data at all. Just silence, as if the operatives had stepped off the edge of the universe. He sent the third team anyway. He was methodical. He needed more data. Losing operatives without explanation was information in itself, but not enough. He needed to understand what was happening before he could adjust. The third team landed on Earth itself, in a forested region of northern Canada, far from any major population center. They moved for 6 hours through dense forest, covering ground efficiently, making for the secondary target on their list, a logistics commander named General Yaw Darko, who kept a small personal residence outside a town called Fort Providence. At the 4-hour mark, the team leader sent a routine check signal. Fine. Normal. Moving on schedule. At the 5-hour mark, nothing. At the 6-hour mark, nothing. Zyvan waited another full day. Then he sent the fourth team, his last, to a different location, entirely, not a target's home or office, but a neutral observation point on the outskirts of Geneva, where they were simply supposed to watch and gather data. No contact with any target. Just watch. 2 hours after landing, the fourth team's communication relay went silent. Zyvan sat in his ship for a long time. 19 Shades. 0 reports. 0 termination signals. No bodies, as far as anyone knew. No alarms triggered on any human news channel. The planet below looked completely normal. Satellite feeds showed traffic and weather, and the quiet movement of a civilization going about its ordinary life. He authorized a scout ship from his secondary team to make a single passive scan of Earth's orbital security. Just a sweep. Nothing aggressive. He needed to know if there was some new human technology that was blocking his operative signals. The scout ship went in. It came back out 7 hours later and transmitted a single data packet before its own communication system failed. The ship drifted. The crew inside were unharmed but completely unresponsive, sitting in their seats with blank expressions, as if something had reached inside their heads and turned a switch. Zyvan opened the data packet. It contained one image. A flat white cloth, laid on a plain surface under clean light. Arranged on the cloth in a neat line were 19 small metal chips. They were Shade identification chips, the kind embedded beneath the skin of every operative, unique to each individual, impossible to fake, and extremely difficult to remove without specialized equipment. All 19, in a row, clean and undamaged, as if someone had removed them carefully and then taken the time to arrange them neatly for the photograph. Next to the cloth, written on a small card in Drath script. Not human script, not any translated version, but fluent, correct, formal Drath script were 9 words. We found your people. We are returning them in pieces. Send better. Zyvan read the note 3 times. He was not, by nature, an emotional being. His work required the opposite. But he was also honest with himself in the way that survivors tend to be, and what he felt, sitting in that ship, looking at 19 identification chips arranged like a message, was something he had not felt in a very long time. He was afraid. He sent the image to Velkara without comment. On Nexus Station, in the middle of the night by station time, Velkara opened the message and stared at the photograph for a long time without moving. Then she forwarded it to the Council's intelligence director and wrote one line beneath it. "We may have made an error in our assessment." In the Grand Chamber, the vote had felt so clean. 44-3. A simple solution to a manageable problem. A young species, barely 2 centuries into space travel, with soft bodies and no history of large-scale galactic conflict. Nobody in that room had thought to ask a different question. Not, can we beat them? But something quieter. Something more careful. What have they been doing while we weren't watching? Councillor Oranthes did not sleep well after the vote. He had not slept well in 11 days, which was roughly how long it had taken for 19 of the galaxy's best assassins to disappear without a single trace inside human-controlled space. He had not been told about the photograph officially. He was a dissenting vote, and the Council's intelligence branch did not brief dissenters on active operations, as a rule. But he had contacts. He had spent 40 years building quiet relationships with people who passed information carefully and trusted him to do the same. One of those people sent him the image at a private address. He looked at it for a long time. 19 chips. 9 words. Drath script. That last part bothered him the most. The Drath language was not simple. It had 4 grammatical registers, a non-linear sentence structure, and a set of formal written conventions that even most council translators got slightly wrong. What was written on that card was not translated. It was not run through a machine. He could tell by the way the letters were formed, the spacing, the slight stylistic choice in the third word that marked a specific level of formality, the kind you used when addressing someone you considered beneath you but wanted to be polite about it. Someone had written that by hand. A human had written it. In perfect, formal, condescending Drath. Oranthes started making careful inquiries. He was not an intelligence officer. He was a diplomat and a legal scholar, and he was, by his own admission, not especially brave. But he was thorough, and he was patient, and he had a specific quality that served him well in quiet investigations. He did not look threatening, so people talked to him. It took him 3 weeks to piece together the shape of what he was looking at. He did not get all of it. He suspected he did not get most of it, but what he found was enough to make him sit alone in his office for a full hour without moving. The Quiet Office. Officially, it was a minor bureau of the Earth Unified Command, listed in their public government records under the heading of Interstellar Affairs, Subdepartment of Counterintelligence. Its budget, as reported, was modest. Its staff count, as reported, was small. It had no public profile. It had never issued a press statement. When human journalists had asked about it, they were given a short official response that described it as a routine administrative body responsible for monitoring potential external threats to Earth security. This was technically true, in the same way that saying the ocean is wet is technically true. The Quiet Office had been active for 63 years. It had been founded in secret by a small group inside the Unified Command, who had looked at first contact with galactic civilization and come to a conclusion that the rest of humanity's government had not fully accepted, that the galaxy was not friendly, that the Council was a political body like any other political body, meaning it had interests and agendas, and members who were willing to do ugly things quietly, and that Earth needed to understand all of it from the inside before anything went wrong. They had started small. Language programs, deep study of Council species, cultural immersion. Then they had started placing people. Not diplomats. Not official representatives. People who disappeared into Council space and became other things. Traders, academics, low-level administrative workers, the kind of people no one looks at twice. They had picked humans with unusual gifts. People who could learn languages frighteningly fast. People who could read social situations across species lines. People who were, in the old human phrase, good at lying. By the time the council voted to send the Shades, the Quiet Office had active agents embedded in 14 council-member governments. 14 out of 47. Including, and this was the part that made Orinthes feel cold, including the Pleiadian Union, his own government. Someone, in his own administration, had been passing information to Earth for an unknown number of years. He did not know who. He was not sure he wanted to know. More than that, the Quiet Office had known about the vote before it happened. They had an asset near enough to the Council's inner circle to receive advance warning of the closed session. They had been briefed on the Shades' deployment before the Shades had even left their staging point. Director Vasquez, the name attached to the Quiet Office in every document Orinthes had managed to find. Always just the name. No image. No physical description had apparently been tracking the Shades' approach in real time and had the entire operation mapped and responded to before a single operative set foot on Earth soil. The Shades had not walked into a trap. That word implied something reactive, something built quickly in response to a threat. What they had walked into was a controlled environment, something built over years, maintained carefully, tested quietly, waiting for exactly this kind of use. Orinthes thought about the young species the Council had discussed so casually in that chamber. Soft. Emotional. Barely 2 centuries into space. He thought about the words that had been used. Manageable. A simple solution. He thought about what those words assumed. That humanity had been sitting in their little solar system, building ships and making noise, essentially reactive, stumbling into Council space without understanding it, refusing authority out of ignorance or stubbornness rather than strategy. He thought about 63 years of patient, quiet, invisible work. Agents embedded so deep, they had become part of other civilizations. A director no one had ever photographed. A bureau that appeared in public records specifically to be overlooked. He thought about the human letter, the one that had offended so many in the Council chamber. The flat refusal to recognize Council authority. He had read it as arrogance. The first time. He read it differently now. It was not arrogance. It was a position statement from people who already knew the Council from the inside, and had decided, after studying it for decades, that submitting to its authority would be a mistake. The letter was not the act of a species that didn't understand the situation. It was the act of a species that understood it better than anyone in the Council chamber had realized. Orinthes wrote a private memo to himself, encrypted under his personal seal, that he did not send to anyone. In it, he wrote one question. If they have been watching us this carefully for 60 years, what else have they prepared that we haven't found yet? He did not have an answer. He suspected no one in the Council did, including the intelligence branch that was currently trying very hard to look like it had the situation under control. Somewhere on Earth, in a building that did not appear on any public map, Director Una Vasquez was standing in front of a wall of screens that showed quiet, ordinary feeds from 14 different Council governments. She was drinking tea. She was not celebrating. She did not appear to feel anything dramatic about what had just happened. She turned to her senior analyst and said, in the same tone one might use to discuss a change in weather, that they should begin the second phase. The analyst asked what the second phase involved. Vasquez set down her tea. Letting them understand, she said, exactly how far behind they are. Velcara was removed from her position as High Ambassador 3 days after the photograph arrived. She was not punished formally. The Council did not do things that way. She was given a quiet reassignment, a senior advisory role with no real power. The kind of job given to people who have embarrassed the institution and need to be moved without making noise. She accepted it without visible emotion, which was very much in character, and she spent her last week in her old office preparing documents for her replacement. But before she left, she made one more push. She spent those final days meeting individually with 31 Council delegates. She did not speak in the chamber. She spoke in small rooms, over meals, in the kind of conversations that don't get recorded. She made a single argument, over and over, and she made it well, because whatever her failures in judgment, Velcara was a good political operator. The argument was simple. The Shades had failed, yes. The operation had been compromised, yes. But what that proved was not that humanity was untouchable. What it proved was that humans had a good intelligence service and had caught the Council off guard. The solution was not retreat. The solution was force. Real force. Not 19 assassins. 4,000 warships from 30 civilizations, moving together. Nobody survives that. Not with clever tricks and embedded agents. When the sky fills with ships and the weapons go hot, intelligence means nothing. 31 delegates agreed with her before she cleaned out her desk. The motion for collective military action passed the following week. The fleet was magnificent. There was no other word for it. 4,000 warships, drawn from the navies of 30 council species, assembled at a staging point in the Karav Expanse, a region of open space 2 jump transits from the Sol system. Some of these ships were centuries old, their hulls carrying the records of dozens of campaigns. Others were newly built, sharp and modern, bristling with weaponry that could crack a moon if directed properly. The combined firepower of that fleet was not a number that translated meaningfully into words. It was simply more than any single civilization in the known galaxy could answer. Fleet Admiral Dross Vane of the Drath Navy stood on the bridge of his command ship, the Sovereign Will, and looked at the assembly on his screens with something close to satisfaction. He was a cautious commander by nature. He did not like large operations with too many moving parts. But even he had to admit that at this scale, caution almost didn't matter. You didn't need precision when you had this much weight behind you. His orders were not to destroy Earth. That was important to note in the official record. The goal was demonstration. The fleet would enter the Sol system, take up positions around Earth's orbital defense grid, and transmit a single message to the unified command. Sign the charter, submit to council authority, disband the intelligence bureau. The humans would look at 4,000 ships, and they would sign. Everyone agreed on this. Even the dissenters had mostly accepted that this was probably how it would end. Dross Vane authorized the jump. 4,000 ships moved. They came out of jump at the edge of the Sol system and found humanity already waiting. Not with 4,000 ships. Not even close. 200 vessels, arranged in a loose formation near the asteroid belt. Small by comparison. A few of them were clearly military. Others looked like modified civilian ships, which Dross Vane found puzzling. He looked at the numbers and actually felt, briefly, almost sorry. This was not a contest. This was not even a gesture. This was 200 ships facing 4,000, and it would be over before it started. He was composing his opening transmission when the first report came in. It came from the Sovereign Will's navigation officer, who sounded confused rather than alarmed, which made it worse somehow. The officer reported that their positional data wasn't matching. The ship's navigation AI was showing them as being in position at the edge of Sol, but external sensor data was showing a star pattern that didn't match Sol at all. Dross Vane told him to run a diagnostic. The diagnostic came back clean. The AI was functioning perfectly. It was certain of its position. It was wrong. The second report came from the Vihari battle group, on the fleet's left flank. Their targeting systems had flagged 3 Drath heavy cruisers as hostile vessels and locked onto them. The cruisers had not done anything provocative. The targeting system simply did not recognize them as friendly anymore. The Vihari commander had overridden it manually, but the system kept reverting. The third report came from the comm center. 43 ships had jumped to incorrect coordinates. Not enemy action, their own jump calculations. Had processed bad data and sent them somewhere else entirely. Where, exactly, was not yet clear. Then came the report that ended the battle before it started. Velkara's old flagship, the Drath Ascendancy, now being used by the replacement High Ambassador, a careful and experienced diplomat named Oru Tev, transmitted a distress signal from an unexpected location. The Drath Ascendancy was not at the edge of Sol. It was at the edge of the Drath home system. It was alone, and it was broadcasting full Council military identification codes on a frequency that the Drath planetary defense grid was programmed to treat as a hostile signature. The Drath home defense grid, following its own protocols, had opened fire on the Council's flagship. Orutev survived. The ship survived. The damage was significant, and the humiliation was total. In the space around Sol, the fleet began to fall apart. Not in battle. Not in defeat. It fell apart the way a building falls apart when the supports are quietly removed from the inside. Commanders found they couldn't trust their own systems. Species that had arrived as allies were suddenly receiving transmissions that made them look like threats to each other. Ships that tried to communicate across coalition lines found their messages being routed strangely, arriving garbled, or not arriving at all. The Mirith contingent received orders, apparently from Fleet Command, to withdraw immediately. The orders were not from Fleet Command. But they looked real, and the Mirith left, and their departure caused 3 adjacent groups to panic about their flank coverage. In 4 hours, the most powerful military force the Council had ever assembled had effectively stopped functioning without the 200 human ships firing a single shot. Drossvane stood on his bridge and stared at his screens, and felt something he had not felt since he was a junior officer making his first mistakes. He felt completely lost. He had 4,000 ships, and every single one of them was dealing with a different problem, and he had no way to sort which problems were real, and which were manufactured, and which systems he could trust, and which had been quietly, invisibly compromised. At some point he could not identify. He did not know when it had happened. He did not know how deeply it went. He did not know if the orders he was receiving from other fleet commanders were real or constructed. He did not know anything with confidence, and that uncertainty was more paralyzing than any weapon. He ordered a general withdrawal. Across the fleet, the order was followed some ships quickly. Some, after confusion about whether the order was genuine, they pulled back. They jumped away from Sol in groups, leaving behind the debris of a plan that had not been countered so much as dissolved. On Earth, in a plane building with no sign outside, Director Vasquez watched the feeds. She finished the last of her tea. She set the cup down. She turned to her assistant and told him to draft a diplomatic communiqué. The communiqué offered the Council a ceasefire and formal negotiations. It specified that negotiations would be held on Earth, at a table of humanity's choosing, on terms that humanity would set as the starting point. There was no anger in the document. No crowing. No list of demands designed to humiliate. It was written in the same clean, formal language the Council used for its own treaties. It was, in every way, the document of a party that had already won and was now being gracious about it. Vasquez read it over once, made 2 small corrections, and approved it. The message was sent. The shape of the new galaxy. 6 months after the fleet withdrew from Sol, the representatives of 31 species sat in a long room in Geneva and tried very hard not to look uncomfortable. The room was not designed to make anyone feel small. That was the first thing Counselor Oranthes noticed when he walked in. The ceiling was high but not oppressive. The chairs were arranged in a wide oval, so that everyone faced everyone else at roughly the same angle. There was no elevated position, no center seat that forced you to look up. The light was warm and came from several directions at once, so there were no hard shadows. Someone had thought about this room carefully. Someone had understood that the way a room is arranged tells the people inside it who holds the power before a single word is spoken. And whoever had designed this room had arranged it to say, simply and clearly, "We are equals here." It was a generous thing to communicate. It was also, Oranthes suspected, a very deliberate one. He took his seat. Around him, the other delegates arranged themselves. Some of them had served on the Council for decades. A few had voted for the Shades. Most of them were keeping their expressions carefully neutral, in the way experienced diplomats do when they are in a room where they are not sure of the rules yet. The human delegation entered from a side door. There were 7 of them. They wore plain clothes, not uniforms, not formal state dress, just well-made clothing in quiet colors. They sat down without ceremony. The one who took the lead seat was a woman of middle age, with short gray-streaked hair, and a face that was calm in a way that felt like it had been calm for a long time. She had no visible rank markers. She was introduced, by a human aide, simply as Director Vasquez. Oranthes looked at her for a moment. This was the person whose name appeared on every document, whose bureau had run 63 years of invisible operations across the galaxy, who had watched 19 shades disappear, and then sent a photograph and 9 words. She looked like someone who worked in a government office and went home to water plants. She looked completely ordinary. He reminded himself that this was probably intentional. The formal session lasted 4 hours. It covered the framework of what would become known as the Geneva Accord, a new treaty between the Galactic Council and humanity that would replace the 3 failed attempts at a charter. The terms were fair. Orinthes had expected them to be harsh, the terms of winners extracted from losers, and they were not. Humanity asked for a permanent seat on the Council with full voting rights. Humanity asked for formal recognition of human sovereignty over human-settled systems, including the 3 that had been disputed. Humanity asked for equal access to the trade corridors the Council managed. Humanity asked for acknowledgement, written into the treaty, that the dispatch of the Shades had constituted an act of war, one that humanity was formally choosing not to respond to in kind. That last point made several delegates very still. It was not a threat. It was written in language that could not be read as a threat. But everyone in the room understood what it meant. It meant humanity was keeping a record. It meant humanity was, in official terms, choosing to let it go, which meant they also had the choice not to. Nobody objected. The session broke for a midday meal, and Orinthes found himself standing near a window that looked out over a courtyard where old trees had dropped their leaves across stone paths. He was holding a cup of something hot that a human aide had pressed into his hand, and he was thinking, as he had been thinking for 6 months, about the question he had written in his private memo. Vasquez appeared beside him. She did not announce herself. She was simply there, also holding a cup, also looking at the courtyard. "It's a nice building," she said. "Yes," he agreed. They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, a bird crossed the courtyard and disappeared into the bare branches of one of the trees. Orinthes had seen birds before. On other worlds, flight was a common enough evolutionary solution, but there was something about the particular unhurried way this one moved that he found himself watching until it was gone. "I want to ask you something," he said. Privately, Vasquez looked at him. She did not say yes or no. She just looked, which he took as permission. "You could have done more," he said. "During the fleet engagement. The embedded agents. The access you clearly have. You could have caused real damage. Economic systems. Political exposure. Things that would have taken years to recover from. You didn't." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Why not?" She looked back out at the courtyard. When she spoke, her voice was the same as it had been all morning, level. Not unkind, carrying no particular weight, which somehow made the words heavier. "We spent 10,000 years doing that to each other," she said. "We had empires. We had one power that ran everything, several times over, and it always ended the same way. It wasn't that the powerful ones were evil, mostly. It was just that when one thing is in charge of everything, it makes mistakes, and there's nothing to catch it. And the mistakes get bigger, and eventually, something breaks that can't be fixed." She paused. "We know how that ends. We've dug up how it ends, on 6 different continents." Orinthes considered this. "So you want balance," he said. "We want a seat," she said. "Not a throne. There's a difference, and we think it matters." He thought about the 44 votes in the Grand Chamber. He thought about how easy it had been to move from political frustration to assassination as a solution. He thought about how nobody in that room had seriously asked what humanity might do in response, because humanity had been assessed as a minor problem, and minor problems don't respond in ways that matter. He thought about 63 years of quiet, patient work, about agents who had built whole lives inside other civilizations, about a director who had watched an assassination attempt against her own leadership and responded not with panic, not with a counterstrike, but with a photograph and a note, and then months of careful maneuvering toward a table like this one. "Your people are frightening," he said. He did not say it as an insult. Vasquez smiled. It was a small smile, brief. "We frightened each other for a long time before we came out here," she said. "We got good at it." The formal session resumed after the break, and by late afternoon, the framework was complete. The human delegation reviewed it, without urgency. There were 2 small amendments, both of which were accepted. The document was initialed by all parties. The full treaty would require ratification, which would take months, but everyone in the room understood that the ratification was a formality. The decision had been made. The shape of things had changed. Humanity joined the council, not as a subject, not as a problem to be managed. As a member with full standing, the 48th species at the table, the youngest and, as several delegates privately noted in messages to their governments that evening, almost certainly the most dangerous. Not because of their ships or their weapons, but because of the specific quality that had made them dangerous long before they ever reached the stars. They paid attention. They remembered. They planned for the long term, and they were comfortable with patience in a way that unsettled species who thought in shorter spans. And they had, somewhere in a building with no sign outside, an office full of people who had spent 60 years learning the galaxy's secrets and had used almost none of them. That last part was what stayed with Orinthes on the long journey home. Not what humanity had done. What they hadn't. 3 weeks after the signing, on a space station above the third planet of the Pleiadian system, a man named Cole Heron sat at a corner table in a bar that smelled of something sweet and slightly metallic and watched the evening crowd fill up the room. He had been on this station for 3 years. He spoke the local language without an accent now. He knew the bartender's name, and the bartender's daughter's name, and which of the regulars was having trouble at home, and which one had just gotten good news. He had, over 3 years, become the kind of person that nobody thinks about very hard, because he had always just been there. He was drinking something that glowed faintly blue in the glass. Across the table from him sat a Mirith, one of the same species as the Shades, narrow and gray-skinned and built close to the ground, with the flat, reflective eyes of a nocturnal hunter. This particular Mirith was named Sev, and Sev worked in the station's administrative office processing cargo manifests. And Sev had, about 8 months ago, said something at this same bar that had made Cole pay closer attention. They were laughing now about something Sev had said earlier, a joke about the new cargo routing system that had made 3 senior administrators argue for an entire afternoon about a classification error that turned out to be caused by a single misplaced decimal point. Cole laughed genuinely. He had always found bureaucratic chaos funnier than most things. Sev waved the bartender over for another round. Cole let the conversation drift and settle, and he sat for a moment in the noise and warmth of the bar and thought about the treaty and the new shape of things and how much work there still was, quiet work, the kind that never made the news and never got statues built for it. He thought about how the galaxy was large, and most of it still did not know what humanity was. Not really. He picked up his glass. He ordered another round. He had nowhere to be.